She told herself she wasn't afraid of him, told herself this was a transaction, a manageable arrangement, a situation she was surviving with her eyes open. She had believed that for months. And then the blizzard came, and he rode into it alone because that was who he was. And she stood at that window, watching the snow swallow him whole. And the fear that rose in her chest wasn't abstract. It wasn't managed. It was specific. It was the fear of a woman who had just realized, without planning to, that she had something to lose. This channel lives in the space where the Old West meets the deepest part of the human heart, where love doesn't arrive with fanfare, but shows up quietly, in blizzards, in shared silence, in a man who builds a garden bed without being asked. The lesson? You know something has become real when the thought of losing it frightens you. That fear isn't weakness. It's the proof that you've started to live again. Subscribe. This story deserves to be heard to the very end. Like it, share it, and drop your country in the comments. Tell me where you are. I want to know.
The day Lena Voss found out she was to be a bride, she was out back of her daddy's feed store, barefoot in the dirt. She was wringing the last bit of water from a shirt so thin you could read a newspaper through the elbows. That New Mexico sun was a relentless hammer, and the dust hanging in the air had the rusty color of dried blood. She was 22 years old, built slight but with eyes that saw everything. She had hair the color of sun-darkened wheat and a stubborn jaw that always got to working whenever she had a mind to argue. And Lena, she had been arguing with something or other her whole life. She argued with the lack of rain, with the rising debt, and with the way the men in Calera Flats would talk right through a woman like she was a ghost. But no argument she had ever had could hold a candle to this one. Her father, Emmett Voss, was standing on the back porch, twisting his hat in his hands and staring hard at the dirt. He delivered the news flat, with no apology, and without the decency to even look her in the eye. "Harlan Cade has made an offer to settle up with the store," Emmett said. "The whole debt, every single dollar we owe to Brixton's bank. And for that, he wants a wife." Lena froze right where she stood, the damp shirt falling from her hands. She had known the name Harlan Cade forever, the same way you know about a dust storm on the horizon. He was a force of nature, big and inevitable, and not something you could do a thing about. Harlan was 41 years old, stood 6'6", and was put together like a walking smokehouse. His cattle ranch was east of town, and he held the papers to 3 water rights and the only decent well in the entire southern part of the valley. He had put one wife in the ground already, a timid woman named Dora. Folks said she just sort of vanished, like a colored cloth bleached by the sun. Now nobody could ever prove he had been unkind. He was just a mountain of a man who was sure of himself and always got what he wanted. "And you told him yes," Lena said. It was a fact, not a question. Her daddy finally lifted his head, and she saw the truth in his eyes. It was not guilt, not really. It was something that felt a whole lot worse. It was relief. The deal was done. The trade was made. She was the price. And he looked like a man who had just set down the heaviest burden of his life. For 3 years, the feed store had been bleeding out. The drought chased off the farmers who took their business with them, and that was the end of it. Lena knew the figures by heart. She had been handling the ledgers since she was 16. She knew the trouble was real. She knew Brixton's bank had already sent 2 notices that very month. Still, she had held on to a sliver of hope. She truly believed her father would figure something else out, because she was his little girl, and that ought to count for something. "It is a fine match," Emmett mumbled, the words landing heavy between them. "He is a man with means. You will not want for anything." Lena let the damp shirt fall to the ground. She did not toss it aside in anger. She just opened her hand and let it drop, the way you let go of something when you have lost all reason to hold on. She went right past her father, making sure not to brush against him, and walked through the back of the feed store, past the familiar scent of grain, dust, and animal. Salt. She stepped out the front door onto the main dusty street of Calera Flats. It was a town so small you could take it all in with one look, from the saloon to the telegraph office to the little church with its leaning steeple. And then there was the road heading east, the road that led straight to Harlan Cade's ranch. As she stood there in the blinding morning sun, it hit her. Her entire life, everything she knew, had just been traded away for a price she did not know, and a deal she never made. Back inside, Emmett Voss sank onto a sack of grain and buried his face in his hands. He tried to convince himself it was the only choice he had. He told himself Lena was tough, she would get by. She always did. He reasoned that Harlan Cade was a decent man, not a cruel one. He repeated these justifications in his head, like a man reciting a prayer that his heart just is not in. But deep down, under all that relief and the cold math of his problems, a little sliver of shame was digging itself in deeper. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and it was the daughter he sacrificed, and he had the nerve to tell himself it was for love. Now, Calera Flats had a long memory, kind of like an old board with hidden splinters just waiting to snag you. The town could still recall Emmett Voss before the dry years, back when he was a big man with a quick laugh, who kept his store so spotless you could serve dinner on the floor. It remembered his wife, Clara, who a fever took when Lena was just 9 years old. Her passing knocked the whole family sideways, and they never did get set right again. Emmett raised 4 kids on his own after that, and the folks in town gave him his due like you would for any man who weathered a bad storm. But giving a man his due is not the same as looking up to him. And everyone had a front-row seat as the store slowly sank, and Emmett's laughter faded to nothing. So when the news about his deal with Harlan Cade got out, nobody in Calera Flats was really shocked. People do what they have to do to get by. And for Emmett Voss, that meant trading away something that he had no right to sell. Lena had 3 brothers, Cass, Ford, and the baby of the family, Trick. His given name was Patrick, but nobody had used it since he was about 5. Cass was 26, married, and working a patch of stubborn dirt north of town, trying to coax some vegetables out of it. Ford was 24 and spent his days at the livery, quiet and steady, clearly happier around horses than he was around folks. Then there was Trick at 17, still looking like a boy trying to figure out the shape of the man he was going to be. Every one of them heard the news the same way Lena did after the deal was already struck, told by their father, with an excuse that was supposed to pass for an apology. It left no real space for them to get angry. Cass just clamped his jaw shut and stared off into the distance. Ford headed for the stable and skipped supper altogether. Only Trick, the youngest, marched right down to Lena's room and rapped on her door. When she opened it, he just stood there, his jaw clenched like he was trying to chew up his words before they came out. He had no right, Trick finally managed to say. Lena leaned on the doorframe looking at her little brother. He had their mama's eyes, a soft green and wide set, and they were swimming with emotions he did not know how to handle. No, she agreed quietly. He surely did not. A heavy quiet settled between them, full of everything they could not put into words. Trick stared down at his worn-out boots. "What are you fixin' to do?" he asked. And Lena, who had passed the whole afternoon on her bed staring at the wall, who had calculated every possible move like it was an entry in a ledger, she had her answer. "I am going to marry him," she said. Trick's head snapped up. "But I am going to marry him," she said again. "And I will do it with both eyes open. And I will find my way through this." She said it calmly, with no fuss, the way someone lays out a plan they have already decided they will live through. Harlan Cade had stopped by the store 3 days before the news broke, and Lena had watched him from the window wondering what he was doing there. She saw what she always saw when he was around, how the man made the doorway look small just by passing through it. He was not a bad-looking man. That was the tricky part of it all. His face was square and tanned by the sun, and his gray eyes watched everything but did not seem mean. He moved with a slow, careful purpose, like a big man who had spent his whole life trying not to break things in a world made for smaller folks. He and her father talked behind the closed office door for a good 40 minutes. As he walked out, he gave Lena a tip of his hat through the window. She did not realize at the time that he was greeting the woman who would soon be his wife. The official word came during the Sunday service. Pastor Gideon read it from a little piece of brown paper that Emmett Voss had handed him. All the people of Calera Flats took in the news with that quiet, polite interest that meant they would be talking about it all afternoon. Lena sat right there in the third row, her back ramrod straight and her hands clasped in her lap. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at a single soul, even when she felt every eye in that room settle on her. After the service, the town's women gathered around her, their well-wishes barely hiding all their burning questions. Mrs. Brixton, the banker's wife, took Lena's hand in both of hers and said, "Well, Harlan Cade is a very comfortable man, my dear." She said it like that was the end of the story, like money was the answer to a question no one had even bothered to ask. Lena just smiled. A smile was easier and cost her a lot less than the truth. Harlan Cade's ranch was named the Ironwood. It was situated on the east end of the valley and looked like it had grown right out of the ground, with no plans of ever leaving. The main house was made of dark wood and heavy stone that had been dragged up from a creek bed 30 miles away. It had a big, wide porch looking out at the mountains and a roof so well built that in all its time, not a single leak had made its way inside. The place was surprisingly clean, which caught Lena off guard when she first stepped in. She figured she would find the kind of mess a man makes living by himself for years, with dirty dishes piled up and dusty rugs. But the house was neat, though it did not have much in it. There was not much on the walls. An old rocking chair sat by the fireplace, smoothed down from years of sitting. A line of books sat on a hallway shelf, looking like they had been read plenty instead of just put out for show. In the kitchen, a pot was simmering on the stove, smelling of sage and slow cooking. Harlan was waiting at the gate when she rode up with Trick, who had been stubborn about coming along right on his horse behind her, watching over her with a fierce kind of loyalty. Harlan tipped his hat when she got closer, a polite gesture that felt a little strange in the wide-open quiet of the prairie. He seemed even bigger out here, with nothing but the sky and the grass to measure him by, surrounded by the deep silence of the valley. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was deep but steady, like a man who had taught himself not to let it roar. Lena swung down from her horse on her own and stared right up at him. She always faced down whatever scared her. It was the only real defense she had against being afraid. "Mr. Cade," she said, "I need to see the house before I can say yes to living here." He walked her through every single room. He gave her straight answers to her questions, never cutting her short or dodging the truth. When she asked about their water, he led her right to the well. When she asked who was closest, he pointed and told her how many miles. And when she asked what his first wife passed from, a question she had to ask, he got real quiet for a moment. Then he told her that Dora had been sick in her lungs for 2 years before she died. The doctor down in Santa Fe called it consumption, and he had spent every last cent he had trying to save her. He did not put on a show when he said it. It was just the plain, hard truth of his life. Lena studied him for a good while before she gave a nod. She did not offer any sympathy. She reckoned he had heard the word sorry until it did not mean anything anymore. She also saw a cradle in the second bedroom down the hall. It was empty and looked like it had not been touched in ages, but someone had kept the dust off it. She did not bring it up. Some things are so clear they do not need questions, and asking would just be cruel. She tucked that image away in her mind, that little wooden cradle in a room that smelled of cedar and loss, and she kept that picture with her as she walked back to the porch, where Trick was propped against a post, eyeing everything with suspicion. Harlan Cade offered them some coffee. Trick said no, but Lena said yes. The three of them sat there on the porch, wrapped in a heavy quiet, as the setting sun turned the mountains to a coppery red. And Lena thought, This place is hungry for a soul to fill it. She just was not sure if she wanted to be that soul. The ride back to town was silent for a while before Trick spoke up. "For such a big fella, he's got kind eyes." Lena shot a look at her brother. "That does not mean a thing," she replied. "It could mean something," Trick insisted with that stubborn wisdom that only the young have. Lena kept riding without a word for another quarter of a mile. She watched the sun disappear behind the mountains and listened to the whisper of the dry wind in the roadside grass. "He was not the one who made the debt," she finally said. "Daddy made it. Harlan Cade is just the one settling it." She spoke like she was putting facts into neat little piles, which is precisely what she was doing. Because Lena Voss had been handling the family ledgers since she was 16 years old. She had seen the numbers turn bad over the years, and she knew one thing for certain. A clear view of the truth was the only thing of value she still owned. They were married on a Thursday in October, under a sky so clean and blue you only see it in New Mexico once the first autumn cold snap clears the air. The wedding took place in the church with the lopsided steeple, and it was over quick, just like Lena wanted. Pastor Gideon said his part. Harlan repeated the vows in that deep, steady voice of his. Lena said her words without a single tremor. She had made up her mind that she would not put on a show of misery for a crowd that was half there to pity her and half there to gawk. She had on her mother's dress, taken in to fit her, with a line of tiny buttons down the back that Trick had fastened for her that very morning with his fumbling, caring hands. The dress had been white a long time ago. Now it was the color of old ivory, which Lena felt was more truthful anyway. Emmett Voss cried through the whole thing. He was right there in the front pew, crying freely like a man who believed his tears were proof of his love. Lena never once looked his way. Her eyes were on Harlan Cade. He was standing at the altar with his big, still hands at his side. His knuckles were scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite figure out. It seemed to her he looked like a man who knew he had been handed something he had not rightly earned, and he was not yet sure how he was supposed to hold it. It was a look of caution, and from a certain way, it almost looked like respect. After the ceremony, folks gathered in the churchyard for a small get-together. Mrs. Brixton put it all together. So there were checkered tablecloths, cold fried chicken, and a cake that looked a whole lot better than it tasted. The guests ate and talked quietly, like people who were not sure what to make of the whole affair. Cass and his wife, Nell, stood off by the fence, not talking to anybody. Lena was surprised to see Ford there. He kept his distance from the crowd, holding a glass of lemonade he had no intention of drinking. He was staring at Harlan Cade, sizing him up like a horse trader checking out a skittish stallion. Trick stayed by Lena's side the whole afternoon, so close she could feel his warmth, and he kept a sharp eye on everyone, as if he was expecting a fight to break out at any second. Towards the end, it was Cass's wife, Nell, who took Lena by the arm. She squeezed her hand and whispered, "You do not have to put on a brave face for me." Lena looked at her. Nell was a practical woman with dark hair and smart eyes, who had walked into her own marriage to Cass knowing exactly what she was doing and never looked back. "I am not putting on a face," Lena replied. "I am managing." Nell watched her for a second, then gave a slow nod. "There is a big difference," she said. "I know," Lena answered, and she truly did. Pretending was acting like you felt something you did not. Managing was building a life with the wood you were given, not the wood you wanted. Lena had been managing things since she was 9 years old, ever since her mother left and never returned, and she was not about to stop. Now the wagon ride out to the Ironwood Ranch as the day ended was the most peculiar part of it all. They sat next to each other on the wagon bench. Lena held her mother's ivory dress bunched up at her knees, while Harlan handled the horses with the easy confidence of a man who had been working with reins his whole life. The sun was setting right in front of them, splashing the trail with orange and red light. They rode for the first mile without a single word. Then, without turning to her, Harlan said, "I know this is not the life you would have picked for yourself." Lena thought about that for a moment. No, she said. It was not. The quiet settled in again. I will do right by you, he told her. It was not some grand promise. It was just a plain statement of what he aimed to do, the way a man talks when he means every word, but has not figured out how to show it yet. Lena kept her eyes on the road and stayed quiet. Deep inside her, a knot that had been pulled tight all day loosened just a little, like a rope finally getting a bit of slack. Those first few weeks at the Ironwood were like a quiet understanding they built without saying a thing. Harlan was up before the sun, and did not come in from the fields until after dark. In the hours between, the ranch took all of him, the cattle, the fences, the water troughs, and the ranch hands. He was not mean to her. He was not exactly friendly either, but he was never cruel. He made space for her in the kitchen without her having to ask. He never ordered her to cook or clean like it was a woman's duty instead of part of their deal. Instead, he just worked right beside her, quiet and expecting nothing, like they were just two people splitting a roof and the chores that came with it, that needed doing. It was a long way from what Lena had been afraid of, but it was also a long way from what she had dreamed of in that secret place where she still held on to a little hope. That hope was stubborn, pushing up like a weed through cracked rock. She started to learn about him piece by piece, the same way you learn the lay of the land by living on it every day. At night, he would sit in that old rocking chair by the fire to read. He would pull a lamp near and fold his large frame over a book, looking almost like he was sorry for being so big. He would take silence over chatter any day. But when he did talk about something that mattered to him, about the land, the stock, and the way the water level kept sinking each year, and what all that meant for the valley. He spoke with a quiet, steady aim that wasn't what she figured she'd get from a man his size. She'd braced herself for a man who was all rough edges. What she found was a sharp mind that moved carefully. It didn't wash away what had happened, but it sure did muddy the waters of the story she'd been telling herself about him. A month later, she stumbled on Dora's things inside a trunk in the cedar room. She wasn't snooping. She was just after a spare blanket because the nights were getting a chill. But the trunk wasn't locked, and when she lifted that lid, she knew in an instant what she was looking at. There was a dress, a hairbrush, a little Bible with a lady's name penned in the front in a fine hand. And underneath it all, a set of baby clothes, folded neat, that had never seen a baby. Lena sat right there on the floor of the cedar room for the longest time, with that trunk wide open before her. It was like the old house itself had decided to whisper its first real secret to her. Dora had been carrying a child when she passed. That cradle in the far room suddenly felt different, heavier, and it pointed to a hurt more specific than just some general sorrow. She kept what she found to herself. She just closed the trunk, went on back to the kitchen, and started on supper. And when he rode in from the range, she saw him in a new light. The way you might look at a fella after you've accidentally read his journal, not with judgment, really, but with the heavy feeling of knowing too much, too quick. He could tell something was up. He noticed because underneath all that quiet and calm, he was a man who saw things. Something amiss? He asked. No, she said, handing him a mug of coffee. He took it and watched her for another second, then just let it be. He had learned, and she was starting to see, that letting things be was one of the main rules he'd built his whole life on. 2 weeks on a cold night when the wind was just clawing its way across the plains and making the window panes rattle, Harlan came in late. He sat down at the table and didn't even make a move for his plate. Lena watched him from the other side of the kitchen. His face was doing something strange. It was unguarded in a way she'd never seen, like a gate someone had plumb forgotten to latch. Lost 2 calves today, he said. The cold snap came on too fast. He said it flat, just stating a fact. But his hands, gripping the edge of the table, were pressing down hard on the wood. Lena pulled up a chair across from him. She didn't say she was sorry. She had a hunch he'd heard the word sorry enough times to wear it clean out. She'd thought that about him before, and she was thinking it again. Instead, she just said, "Tell me what needs doing. Tomorrow." He raised his head and looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "I'll show you," he said. Mteet Voss rode up to the Ironwood on a Tuesday in November. He was on a borrowed horse because his own had pulled up lame. He wore the look of a man who's been going over a conversation in his mind for weeks and knows it still ain't right. Lena spotted him coming from the porch. She was fixing a fence rail, which wasn't on her list of things to do that day, but it needed doing, so she was doing it. She put her tools down and waited. She didn't step toward him. She made him come all the way to her, because she needed those few extra seconds to school her features into a blank slate. She hadn't exchanged a word with her father since the wedding. She hadn't realized until that very moment, standing on the porch of a house she was slowly getting the measure of, just how much of her was still raw from it all. He climbed down from the horse with the stiffness of an older fella trying to pretend he wasn't one, and he stood at the foot of the porch steps, holding his hat in his hands. She noticed he always did that, held his hat when he had a hard thing to say, like that hat was some kind of anchor. And he said, "Lena, I need to ask you something." "You should have asked me things before now," she said. Her words were low and steady, which carried more sting than a shout ever could. He flinched. "I know that," he said. "I know, but I'm asking now." She just waited. He said, "Ford's been let go from the livery. Brixton called in the rest of what's owed on the store's note. The part Harlan's settlement didn't take care of. There was a second note I didn't bring up." Lena went perfectly still. "A second note," she repeated. The amount he named wasn't huge for men who owned ranches and water rights. But for a failing feed store with nothing coming in, it was the same as standing on the edge of a canyon. EMTT stood there in the chilly morning air and laid it all out with the frantic detail of a man who's waited too long to come clean and is now letting it all pour out. The second note had been taken out 2 years ago, back when MTE was sure the drought was bound to break and everything would turn around. It never did. He'd just pushed that note to the back of his mind, figuring he'd handle it, right up until the bank sent one letter, and then another, and now a final notice. Lena heard him out, not saying a word. When he was done, she said, "You set up my marriage to settle a debt you didn't even have the decency to fully explain to the man you were asking for help." The hope just collapsed out of Mteet's face in a way that was truly awful to see. Not because it was unfair, but because he had it coming. "I thought Harlan's payment would cover everything," he said, his voice thin. "I thought you thought," Lena said, and those 3 words landed with the heavy thud of a closing door. She turned and walked back inside. She stood in the kitchen for a second with her hands pressed flat on the table, breathing through the fire in her chest, counting it down just like she'd learned to do with debt columns when the figures made her want to bust something. Then she walked to the writing desk in the corner and pulled out paper and a pen. She was writing when Harlan came in. "Bank note," she said, plain as day, not even looking up. "It's not big, but it's not small either. He came to see if you'd cover it." She put the pen down. She looked right at him. "I'm not asking you to," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "I want that understood. I'm telling you because you've got a right to know the whole picture of what you married into. What you do about it is your own affair." Harlan stood there quiet for a long stretch. His gray eyes went from her face to the paper on the desk and then back again. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. And Lena, who had not seen that question coming, who had braced herself for a man who would just make up his mind and announce it, felt something shift deep inside her chest. That little shift, she was beginning to realize, was a dangerous thing, because it meant she was starting to trust him. "I want you to be angry at him," she said. "I'll take care of the rest." Harlan rode into Calera Flats by himself the next morning. He left early, before the town had properly woken up. He went to the bank first. Lena knew this on account of Trick telling her. Trick, who had a knack for being in the right place at the wrong time, had been at the general store when Harlan rode through. He'd quietly trailed him from a ways back, driven by a need to look out for his sister, and by the complicated respect that was growing for the man his sister had married. Harlan walked into the bank. He was in there for 11 minutes. When he came back out, he headed for the feed store. EMT was there, just opening up for the day, and Harlan stood in the doorway and spoke to him. Trick, watching from across the road, said later he couldn't make out the words, but that his father's face turned white as a sheet inside of 30 seconds. Here is what Harlan said to EMT Voss. He told him he'd paid the second banknote. He'd paid every last cent, no strings attached, no haggling. But first, he'd made Brixton draw up a piece of paper, a formal accounting, signed and witnessed, that laid out the entire history of the store's debt in plain detail, including the note EMT had kept hidden from Lena and from Harlan himself. This paper was made up in 3 copies. Harlan kept one for himself. He sent another one to Cass, Ford, and Trick, all together, so Lena's brothers would know every last fact about what their father had and had not done. And the 3rd copy he carried to the store and put right in MTT's hands, because he believed a man ought to have to hold the written proof of his own choices. "I'm not doing this for you," Harlan told MTT. Trick couldn't hear the words, but Lena heard them later from her own father, who came to the Ironwood 3 days after and stood on the porch, looking smaller in a way that had nothing to do with his height. "I'm doing it because your daughter is my wife, and she shouldn't have to carry the burden you made." Then Harlan said one last thing, still in that low, measured voice that never had to get loud because it always said exactly what he meant. "You don't come to her with your money troubles again. Not ever. You come to me first, and I'll decide if we're going to have a conversation." EMT had just stood there and taken it, because there was nothing else for him to do, and because the man was right. Lena learned about it all on Friday evening. Harlan came home, sat across from her at the supper table, and told her. He told her simply the way he told her most things, straight and without any extra flourishes, just the order of how it all happened. He watched her face the whole time he was talking, and when he finished, he just waited. Lena sat there with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, the fire crackling behind her and the sound of the wind outside making the whole house feel snug and warm. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't. Do you wish I hadn't?" She considered it. She pictured Emteet's face on that porch holding his hat. She thought about that written record, that formal accounting, and her brothers holding the truth in their own hands. "No," she said. "I wouldn't have it any other way." It was the truest thing she had ever spoken to him. That night she walked down to the end of the hall, opened the door to the cedar room, and just stared at the cradle for a good long while. She had been thinking of Dora more than she let on, even to herself. She thought about the tiny baby clothes packed away in the trunk, and about Harlan building this place with the kind of care a man takes when he means for it to shelter a family. Then she thought about him watching that dream just fade away. She didn't step inside. She just stood there in the doorway, looking at that cradle. And what she felt was not pity. She knew right off that Harlan Cade was not a man who needed pity from her or anybody else. No, it was something closer to heartache, the kind of specific sadness you feel for a person. It was like seeing a loss that was there long before you showed up, a deep crack in the floorboards you have to learn to walk around. She pulled the door shut softly. She went back to the kitchen, poured another cup of coffee, opened a book, and slowly started to make a life in that house. It was Trick who stirred up the trouble, the way the youngest brother often does. It wasn't from being careless, but from the raw courage of someone who ain't yet learned that some truths are better left to sit a while before being spoken. He rode out to the Ironwood one Sunday in December and found Lena in the stable brushing her horse down. He stood there in the stable doorway, his shoulders all knotted up and his hat shoved back on his head. He said, "I've got to tell you something about Cass." Lena just kept on brushing. "Then tell me," she said. This is what Trick told her. Cass had paid a visit to Brixton's bank 2 weeks before Harlan's second payment was due. He didn't go there to ask questions, he went there to make a deal. He offered Brixton a piece of his land, that dry northern patch he'd been fighting with, if the bank would call in Harlan's entire debt right then and there. Lena froze, the brush still in her hand. The horse shifted its feet and let out a long breath. He wanted the whole debt called in, she said, before Harlan had a chance to pay again. Trick just nodded, his face a picture of misery. Brixton turned him down flat, said the land wasn't worth near enough and the deed had problems anyway. But Cass... Trick trailed off. "He what?" Lena asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "He went and found Harlan's hired man, the one they call Vetch. He told him the Ironwood's east fence was creeping onto public grazing land, which it ain't. I've seen the survey maps myself. But Vetch, he went and repeated it to the county assessor. Now there's a big cloud over Harlan's eastern boundary. It won't stick, but it's going to cost a pile of time and money to set it straight." Lena put the brush down. She stood right there, in the middle of the stable, with the cold December wind seeping through the walls and her horse's warm breath on her shoulder. "Why?" she asked. It wasn't a real question. Deep down, she already had the answer. Cass was the oldest, the one who was supposed to be able to make things right. He had to stand by and watch his father make a bargain that used his own sister like she was cattle for trading, and his anger, instead of aiming at his father where it belonged, it got all twisted up. That's how anger gets sometimes in folks who just can't stand to hate the one they love. It bent sideways and pointed right at Harlan. If Harlan's reputation suffered, if his money got tangled up, if he looked a little less steady, well, maybe the marriage would fall apart. Maybe Lena would come on home, was the thinking of a man who couldn't change what was already done. So he was trying to stop a future that scared him to death, a future where his sister belonged to somebody else completely. It was ugly and small, and it had done real harm, and it all came from a love that was tight enough to smother a person. She told Harlan that evening. She was done keeping secrets from her husband to protect her own kin. It was a fool's errand, and she'd seen the damage it could do. Harlan listened, and then he got quiet in that way he had when he was wrestling with something and was determined not to let his temper get the best of him. You could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. His hands were laid flat on the tabletop. She watched him hold himself perfectly still and thought, that's what a man looks like when he knows his own fire and has chosen to be bigger than the flames. "He's going to have to make it right," Harlan said finally. "The business with the assessor." "Yes," Lena said. "He will." "I'm not going to be the one to go to him," Harlan stated. "That's your business to handle if you're up to it. But it's got to be handled." "I know," Lena replied. She rode over to Cass's place the next morning all by herself, not telling a soul where she was headed. She went out in the bitter cold, while the frost still clung to the grass and her every breath was a little white cloud. Cass met her at the gate. He must have seen her coming from a ways off. She could tell by the look on his face that he knew she knew. She swung down from her horse and stood there holding the reins, looking at her oldest brother. This was the man she'd always looked up to, the one who taught her to ride a horse, sink a fence post, and read the clouds for a coming storm. She said, "You're going to ride to the county assessor's office today, and you're going to tell him you made a mistake." Cass stood there, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, his eyes fixed on the hard, frozen dirt. "And if anything like this ever happens again," Lena said, "you and I are finished." She said it without a lick of anger, just with pure clarity. It was the hard, clear line of a woman who'd finally planted her feet and wasn't about to be moved. The blizzard hit in January, and it didn't give much warning. In less than 2 hours, the sky turned from a peaceful gray to a roaring white mess. By the time Harlan knew just how bad it was going to get, 3 of his hired men were already out on the eastern range. They were with a small bunch of cattle that had drifted down toward the dry creek bed. He went after them himself without asking anyone to come along because that was the man he was. He was the kind of man who walked straight into trouble because that land and those animals were his to look after, and he had never once in his grown life turned his back on that duty. Lena watched him ride off from the porch. She watched the snow just swallow him up piece by piece. First his outline blurred, then his whole shape vanished, then there was only the sound of his horse's hooves, and then there was nothing at all. The wind kicked up something fierce. She went inside and stood by the window, and she felt a space open up inside her chest that she hadn't known was there. She was scared. This wasn't the vague, manageable fear she'd felt standing in the yard barefoot the day her father told her about the marriage. This was a real, sharp fear. It was the kind of fear that only comes when you've got something you can't bear to lose. She stood at that window for 20 minutes as the storm got thicker and the cold deepened, and the big pine trees out by the yard bent over like they were being punished. And then she was done just standing at the window. She went out to the stable and threw a saddle on her horse. She was not a foolish woman. She knew good and well that riding into a blizzard by yourself was the exact sort of thing that got folks killed in New Mexico in January. She also knew that Harlan had gone out there alone because he didn't want to risk anyone else. That was the way a man thought when he'd been shouldering every burden alone for so long. He forgot he could share the load. She found him down by the creek bed, a place she knew to find because she knew this land now. She had learned it the way she learned everything else step by step because she had to. He was there with 2 of the hands, all 3 of them fighting in the howling whiteout to shove the cattle back toward the ranch. One of the hands' horses was down. The poor creature had broken through a thin sheet of ice over a gully and couldn't get its legs back under it. Harlan was there with a rope, along with the other man, and they were pulling with a terrible and mighty effort in the biting cold. Lena rode right up without a word and went straight to the head of the fallen horse. She took its bridle and started murmuring low and steady in the horse's ear, the same way she had calmed frightened animals since she was a little girl. The horse heard her. Its breathing settled, and on the very next pull it scrambled to its feet. They made it back to the ironwood just as the last bit of gray light was fading from the sky. Hands headed for the bunkhouse. Harlan saw to the horses. Lena went into the kitchen and built up the fire, put a pot of water on, and noticed her hands were shaking. She saw it with a strange sort of distance, the way you notice your own body doing something you never told it to do. When Harlan finally came inside, he was caked in snow. His face was chapped raw, and his coat was dark and stiff with ice. He stopped right in the doorway and just looked at her. "You came out there," he said. "Yes," she answered. She set a cup on the table and turned to look him square in the eye. A new quiet settled between them, different from all the other silences before. It wasn't the quiet of 2 strangers learning to live in the same space, but the deep quiet that comes after you have been through hell and back with someone. "I was scared," she said, "when you left." Saying it cost her a piece of her pride, but she paid it all the same. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides. Everything Harlan did seemed to eat up distance in a hurry. He sat down at the table and looked at her with those gray, steady eyes. She realized then that he had been watching her from the very start with something she'd been too stubborn to name. "I would have come back," he told her. "I know," she said. "I went out there anyway." And then, because she was Lena Voss, and she didn't like to leave important things hanging in the air, she said, "I want to open the cedar room. I want to bring the cradle out." She paused, searching for the right words. "I'm not saying right this minute, or even soon. But I want it out of that room and in this house, because a house with a locked door is a house with a wound that ain't yet healed, and I want this one to heal." Harlan just looked at her for a long, quiet moment. His big hands were laced together on the table. His face had that open look on it again, like a door someone had forgotten to latch. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet but sure, like a man who'd just been given a gift he'd long ago given up on ever getting. March eased into the valley slowly after that. The way good things sometimes do when you've been waiting for them without any promises. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little. It was a change so gradual you could barely see it until you glanced back and realized just how far you had come. The snow melted off the porch first, then it disappeared from the yard and finally from the field nearest the house. It was like the warmth in the ground had been waiting patiently all winter and was now ready to rise. Lena started a little vegetable garden by the south wall of the house. She had dreamed of it since November, using seeds from a catalog that she kept safe all winter in a tin box on a kitchen shelf. Harlan built her a raised garden bed from scrap wood, and he did it without her even asking. He just showed up one Saturday morning with lumber, nails, and a level, and he spent the entire day on his knees in the dirt. He measured and fit each piece with the kind of deep concentration of a man building something that meant much more than it looked. Emmett arrived in April. He rode his own horse this time, all healed up, and he came late in the afternoon. The light was long and golden, and the new spring grass was starting to show in the pasture. Lena went down to the gate to meet him. She had a feeling this talk was on its way. You can sometimes feel a difficult conversation coming, like the air pressure changes right before a big storm. She had gotten herself ready, not by rehearsing her words, but by deciding in her heart how she was going to feel. She was going to feel like a person who had moved on. That was not the same as forgiving. Forgiveness was a whole lot bigger than a single afternoon could handle, but she had moved on. Emmett stood at the gate holding his hat, and he seemed older than she remembered, and smaller. Not physically smaller, just smaller in the way a man can seem when his own story about himself gets rewritten by the facts. He said, "I should have handled things a different way." Lena just nodded. "Yes," she said. "You surely should have." He said, "I think about your mama. I think about what she would have said." Lena let that hang in the air for a second. She'd have said what I'm saying. Lena told him, and she'd have said it a whole lot louder, too. For a brief moment, the shadow of a smile might have crossed Emmett's face, but it vanished quickly. "Are you getting by?" he started to ask. "Yes," Lena said, cutting him off because she already knew the question. "Are you okay? Are you making it? Did you survive it all?" And the answer to every one of those was the same. "I am all right," she said. "I need you to know that. I need you to know I am truly and honestly all right. It is not because I am forgiving you right now, but because I built a new life for myself in spite of everything that happened." She said it with a clear voice, not unkindly, just as truthfully as she knew how. Trick was now visiting every week. He had started making himself useful around the ranch. He was like a lot of young men with more energy than direction, always fixing things that were loose, riding out to check on the fences, and helping with the heavy work in the early mornings. Harlan paid him a fair wage and treated him like a grown man. Trick had not always been treated with that kind of respect, and he accepted it with a quiet dignity and thankfulness that was genuinely touching to see. Ford had come by twice. Both times he just stood on the porch with a glass of lemonade he never drank. On his second visit, he had looked Harlan right in the eye and said, "You kept your word." His tone made it both a statement of fact and an apology for ever doubting him. Harlan had just said, "I aim to." And that settled the matter completely. Two men, two short sentences, and a whole world of understanding passed between them. On a warm evening in late April, Lena stood on the wide porch of the Ironwood Ranch. She looked out over the valley as the mountains turned dark, painted gold and purple by the setting sun. The cattle were moving slowly and peacefully in the lower pasture, and the first little green sprouts were starting to poke through the soil in her garden. Harlan came out and stood next to her, and she was aware of him. It was the kind of awareness you have about something you have known for a good while without saying it out loud. She was glad he was there, not just nearby. Glad he was there. The difference was important. She had finally learned the difference between what she could simply get through and what she could truly want for herself. And she was standing right there in that small, amazing space between the two. Trick says Ford might come and work on the ranch this summer. She said that. I heard, Harlan said. They stood together in the last bit of the day's warmth. The valley spread out below them, huge and alive, and filled with everything that was still to come. This life had been forced on her. But the things she was now building within it, those things were all hers. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.